there's no way to freeze in time culture, or the culture of psychiatric science. It can only be understood in the flux of time, in terms of what we could call history. So I don't apologize for what I've done. It was quite intentional, and I believe unavoidable. So let me move on to your second criticism. And the second criticism could be, well, you talk about discontinuities and so on, but really we have something now in science. I cannot speak for every science, Professor Young, but I can speak for psychiatric science, that distinguishes us from the past. And if you want to make a dividing line between 1980 before and after, fine. That distinguishes us from before 1980, from the psychodynamic view of mind and disorders, the psychoanalytic culture. We have something that they don't have, and that is we have a principle, and the principle is one of falsificationism. It goes back to Karl Popper, and it's not complicated to describe what it is. But if I understand correctly, this was and remains one of the main criticisms of psychoanalysis, and the fact that it never was scientific, despite what you're telling us, because it could not meet the standard of what we call modern science, i.e. falsificationism. And falsificationism is, as you already know, that science proceeds by means of hypotheses and testing the hypotheses. And that in order to do this, the hypothesis must have the quality of being falsifiable. You can't have a hypothesis that can't be falsified. There's no way to test it. So you have to frame your hypothesis in a way that it can be falsified. And then what we do is that we have an experiment and we test that hypothesis, and what we do our best to do is to falsify our own hypothesis. And if we cannot falsify it, we're delighted, because that means that we're coming close to something like what you called the uncovering of reality. And if we can retest it again and again and again, and every time, no matter what angle we come from, we can't falsify it, in the end, we come as close as we can to something called the truth. And psychoanalysis could never do that, still can't do it. Even though they've made up lots of experiments in which they claim they could, they've never done it. They cannot, and their problem is they know about the process, but they cannot frame within the culture of psychoanalysis a falsifiable hypothesis, and therefore they can't test it. And that's the difference between us, and that's what makes them a culture, and that's what makes us, you'll forgive the expression, a science. Okay. Now, I've heard people say this many times, less frequently now than in the past, within psychiatry. Now, in fact, what falsificationism is a principle, and it's a terrific principle. I would be the last person in the world to say we should jettison it. No, we should live by it. This really is a very, very useful, not only useful, but indispensable to us. However, it is not a principle by which we uncover reality. It too is a cultural principle, and I'm going to show you how it is a cultural principle. And I have no recommendations for how to improve it. I mean, this is the way that we limp along and muddle through the world as human as human beings. What it is really, falsificationism, and what comes after as an extension of falsificationism, and that is what is today the gold standard in psychiatry. And the gold standard for many people have a conditioned reflex. Say, gold standard. And they have to say, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? RCT. Okay, so that's an extent. The randomized controlled trial is a good example of the principle of falsificationism. Okay, principle is a rather abstract word. I want a more precise word to describe what falsification is. Falsificationism is within the culture of psychiatric science. And the word that I would use and do use is the word metaphysics. It's part of the metaphysics of the culture. Just as a theology can have metaphysical principles, a science can have metaphysical principles. And you don't like the word metaphysics, it's okay, you don't have to use it. Could use the word ideology, would work just as well. But used in a completely neutral sense, a morally neutral sense. That is to say, as part of the ideas and the apparatuses and so on, part of the Denkstuhl. It's not something that's alien that has wandered in. It's not something that's mysterious. And in fact, by and large, it works in a wonderful way. It doesn't work perfectly, and it certainly doesn't uncover reality. Well, you say, well, what's wrong with falsificationism? I mean, when Karl Popper first proposed it in the 1940s, everyone was very excited, still taught as, and what is wrong with it? Well, in one sense, it's a good question. What is wrong? There's nothing wrong with it. In a way, it should work perfectly. That is a very Kuhnian notion. We get closer and closer to truth because we keep on proving that we can't falsify our hypothesis until finally we get to a point that's as close as we'll ever get to uncovering the world. There are two problems with falsificationism in terms of that interpretation. One problem is, maybe a pseudo-problem, and that problem is that when we frame the hypotheses are framed in terms of forms of knowledge and styles of reasoning that already have presumptions about it. So if we're going to have a principle, falsificationism, and use it, falsify hypotheses about a particular psychiatric disorder, immediately we've got a problem, right? And the problem is that we've got a set of classifications, and we've already taken those classifications on board, and we've taken them for granted. So you can say, okay, so that's right, because all the variables are themselves products of culture. So even though we have this procedure, the procedure is only as good as the products of culture and history that go into the hypothesis. You all understand what I'm saying. I don't know how powerful a criticism that actually is, because a falsificationist would say, okay, I understand the point you're making about the classifications and so on. But let me use a metaphor that philosophers of science use, Hacky uses, and to ask about a classification and say, what is our ideal? What is it that we look for in a classification? What would the perfect classificatory category be? And Hacky says, other philosophers use the same metaphor. It will be one that cuts nature at the joints. Now, the idea of cutting it at the joints is, the idea of eating a turkey, and having one of those electric knives that cut it. And there are two ways of cutting a turkey, not butchering any animal, but particularly cutting a turkey. The way that some people do, and where they just start hacking off bits and pieces from it and mangle the turkey. And that's okay if you're with close friends, but if you're serving a nice dinner, no one ever does it that way. Everybody wants to do it, say. They cut it in a way that the drumsticks come off and the breasts are exposed and they can be cut. Well, you get the idea of doing the whole thing and do. Okay, what we're doing in cutting that turkey up is we're cutting it at the joints. And they use this very humble metaphor for talking about nature, that a classification, a really good classificatory system, should work in that way, should not mangle a reality, but you'll cut it at the joints. That is the way that nature has already established things. So that would be our ideal. And that would be one in which you get closer and closer to uncovering the world rather than making the world. And the argument is, if you start off with a bad classification, you're going to start falsifying immediately because it doesn't cut nature at the joints. And in a way, by working through that classification, eventually you're going to arrive at one. So maybe that's not such a good criticism of falsificationism. Falsificationism is a way of improving your classifications. So it's not really a good criticism. But wait, you said you had a second criticism. Yeah, I have a second criticism. And the second one, I don't care what you say, you're not going to be able to show me it's not a valid criticism. And the second criticism is that falsificationism is a wonderful principle that no one adheres to. That is to say, it's the way that we're supposed to do things, but it's not the way that psychiatric science proceeds. It's not the way that any science proceeds. And why is that? Why is it? We're constantly falsifying hypotheses. It turns out it's almost impossible not to falsify all of the hypotheses that we produce. We're constantly falsifying that. Now, if in fact that's the case, and we are adhere to a strict standard, what we should do is junk the hypothesis. But we don't junk the hypothesis. Why? Because we're fools? No, of course not. Because we don't know? No, we do know. We don't junk the hypothesis for several reasons. One reason is that we, in this case the researchers and the advocates of the research, almost always have a vested interest in the hypothesis. Why else would you do it? Why else would you pursue it? Unless you believe that, in fact, I mean, if your idea is to go through the world and showing that things are not true, you're not going to last very long in terms of people wanting to listen to you. People don't call you a scientist any longer, you're a crank. So we pursue what we're most interested in. People have got a vested interest in it. Institutions have a vested interest in hypotheses. That's not an accident. It's not a bad thing. We can't imagine the world in any other way than that would be true. So there's a vested interest in not abandoning a hypothesis. That is number one. There are two reasons that they're not abandoned. Reason number two is Karl Popper. Now, Karl Popper was the guy who proposed falsificationism in the first place. And Popper said, well, you know, if we look at the history of science and we look at the history of fruitful hypotheses that panned out and that were productive in some way, what we notice is something that they all share. And they all share the fact that they've been falsified and that they were not abandoned and that people stuck to them in a very stubborn way for all the reasons that I've just described and kept on plugging away. In most of the cases, they didn't pan out. In some of the cases, they did pan out. So this resolution, this emotional attachment, this ignoring of the injunction, if it's falsified, get rid of it and move on to a better hypothesis, does not really capture what actually goes on in science, or what could go on in science. It's a principle, but like a lot of principles that some of us share, it is honored as much in the breach as in the fact of people honoring it. So it's a kind of a guide, a kind of a, well, I use the word a metaphysic. It is a kind of a metaphysic. So you understand, you know, that why I use the term metaphysic. Now, what I've told you I think is interesting enough, but we can make it more interesting. We can make it more interesting if we move now to Ian Hacky. And Hacky said, well, Popper was absolutely right about being stubborn, falsifiable hypotheses, intrinsic to the new science of the new psychiatric science, blah, blah, all of those things. But how? Let's ask the question, because we're interested in what people actually do. interested in the Denk Collective as well as Denk Stil. What do people do the moment they have falsified a hypothesis? I mean, they're doing it all the time. Now, in case you don't know, let me recommend something. Go to your computer and then go where it says online e-journal, so you can go to any psychiatric journal. Go to the Archives of General Psychiatry, go to Biological Psychiatry, Psychological Psychiatry, American Journal, any of them, and look at a research article. They're all testing in exactly the way that Popper prescribed in this way. They're all falsifying their hypotheses. What do they do next? Well, what they do next is they move on to the discussion section. And in the discussion section, they explain why the results are illuminating, why the results explain something that was not known before. Even though it falsifies the original hypothesis, it illuminates some aspect of reality that was not known before, and enables us to, they use words like refine. They enable us to refine the original hypothesis. Now we have a word in philosophy for this, coined by a physicist, the famous French physicist philosopher, Kuhn. And Kuhn coined the term auxiliary hypothesis. And an auxiliary hypothesis is a hypothesis, sub-hypothesis, that explains why the original hypothesis did not work under the original conditions. What else we have to take into consideration? For example, if it involves a hypothesis involving epidemiology, what risk factors might be involved that we were ignoring up to this point that would refine our choice of a sample for, you get the idea, you know what this is. So the auxiliary hypotheses are a way of preserving the original hypothesis. And this becomes, now Hacking adds something in addition to that. And Hacking adds, in addition to that, he says, well, it's not only that the scientist then adds auxiliary hypotheses. Remember, science is all about praxis. It's all about practices. It's not just about ideas. It's about apparatuses. It's about technologies. More often than not, the failure to not falsify a hypothesis also leads the researchers back to refining their apparatus, back to refining their techniques in some way. So it's not simply a matter of adding new ideas, but it's also a way of altering or transforming to some extent the material means of production. So everything is changing over time, not just the ideas, but also the way in which facts or factoids are being produced in this way. So, and this now is often called the Hacking hypothesis of changing ideas and changing practices in this way. Okay, so you get what the idea is. You get how things proceed in this way. Let me reintroduce someone that I discussed a moment ago, because he's very important in this regard. And I think further illuminates the point that I'm making about how cultures are created and how cultures are sustained, specifically with regards to psychiatric science. And that person is Thomas Kuhn. And remember Thomas Kuhn's notion of scientific revolutions. He says one will replace another. There was the Ptolemaic view of the universe, and then the Copernican view of the universe. How do these revolutions occur? Well, they occur in a variety of ways, but most often, well, Kuhn says, they occur in a very interesting way. That the presumption that people often make is that one science will replace another science, that is, the revolutionary science will replace what had been the normal science because it is better, it knows more, it can, in a word or two, it can explain more than the original one, than the normal science. So the revolutionary science would pick that because it can explain more than the original one. And that's this idea that science is a progression, a gradient that's going up. Kuhn says it's absolutely untrue. You can believe what you want, but I've looked at the history. I've looked at the history of physics. That's not what happened in physics. It didn't happen with regards to the Copernican universe and the Ptolemaic universe. You know, they had the Earth and all the concentric circles around the Earth. So if you compare the two of them at the time of the revolution, the Ptolemaic universe, the old one, explained a lot more than the Copernican universe did. The Copernican universe could do one thing that the Ptolemaic universe could not do. And that one thing was revolutionary, and it made the difference. And the one thing that it did is that as any scientific culture develops over time, and a paradigm develops over time, and the efforts to falsify hypotheses produce anomalies over time. Those anomalies gradually accumulate. There are all sorts of problems that emerge. And those problems look at the time as if they're completely unconnected to one another. People cannot explain why those anomalies occur, but they seem to be random in some way and can be ignored for the time being. We'll eventually get back to that and do that. What a revolutionary science can do, and he says, I'm not prescribing what a revolutionary science should be. I'm describing what it is from looking at the history of the sciences. What it can explain is one thing. It can explain the anomalies. It can connect all of what looked like random exceptions and connect them all into a single explanation. That's what it can do. And in that sense, it's almost parasitic on the old normal science, because the normal science has produced all these anomalies, all of these exceptions, and the revolutionary science then can say, these are all dots. I can connect the dots. And by connecting you get the idea. Well, it's a wonderful, wonderful idea. And it's a wonderful insight into the nature of scientific revolutions. But again, it underscores the fact that what we were talking about is essentially a cultural process. Why, we ask, why should those anomalies bother us? Why should we care that they're all the anomalies and that they can't be explained? Well, I guess there are a lot of explanations for it. Whatever those explanations are, those are not principled explanations. They lie somewhere in the culture of particular sciences, or maybe in some broader culture, a kind of the way that we used to be told that nature abhors a vacuum. Well, maybe people abhor anomalies of various kinds, or maybe some kinds of people abhor anomalies. And maybe those some kinds of people are those who are gathered together in den collectives that we call scientists and research groups. Me, I have no problem. I live in a world full of anomalies and it doesn't bother me. I don't feel any urgency to connect them up. And perhaps I would not be a good scientific researcher for those reasons. But obviously within research communities, that's not the attitude. Okay, the long and the short of it is that even this one exception that you plucked out, the principle of falsificationism, is not a rejection of the idea of cultures of science, cultures of psychiatric science, but rather it's a vindication of it. I would like to, in a way, illustrate my point with the example that Paul Feyerabend used, and that is Zondi Witchcraft. Now, Zondi Witchcraft, again, he made a very radical claim, and his claim is that there's no difference between Zondi Witchcraft and psychiatric science. There's an enormous difference between them, but the difference is not the difference that one is culture and one is something other than culture. So what I would like you to do is, if you would look at that first sheet again, and go down to the, and you'll see under proofs here about falsificationism, that is what I've been discussing. But go down to the bottom, it says a classic ethnographic example. And I suspect no one here has ever read this book. Even today, most anthropological students have not read it. It's a very interesting book. It's a monograph in ethnography, and was published at almost the exact same time as the Origins and Genesis of a Scientific Fact. And they parallel each other in a very interesting way. One is an effort to understand the epistemology or the culture of the Wasserman test, and the other is an effort to understand witchcraft amongst a people, very large group of people, ethnic group, who live in the southern Sudan. And these are people who are known today too as the Azande. And it's a Bantu language, so that sometimes you see on the page it says Azande, sometimes it says Zande. Okay, this is the way we have to do it, because it's the way they do it. Zande is the adjective, or one individual. So in the Bantu languages, oh, you'll love them. Forget everything else I said. Bantu languages, they always put the plural at the beginning of the word. And that's right, they put the A at the beginning, so Azande. Evans Pritchard was one of the great anthropologists of all times, and he was invited. He was at Oxford University. He was a young man, and he was offered an opportunity to go to the southern Sudan. Now, it's a different country, right? For about a year. And in the southern Sudan lived this very large group of people, the Azande, who were very interested to the British and at one time to the French. They wanted to put them into uniforms and web belts and give them guns, and then to move into other parts of Africa. Very tough guys. In any event, Evans Pritchard was asked to go to them. British had given the idea of putting them in uniform, and now had a different idea. And the idea was to replicate a cotton growing scheme that they had already introduced into Egypt, further up the Nile. And this is all the way down the White Nile, into Egypt. And they wanted to introduce it into Zondi land, and they would cultivate this very good Egyptian cotton, long fiber Egyptian cotton. The Zondi would become relatively better off, the British would become much better off, and everyone would be happy in doing this. The problem was a problem of mainly with regards to tsetse fly and sleeping sickness, encephalitis. And the British had a successful scheme for controlling it. But what the scheme required was the nucleation of hamlets, because the Azande lived dispersed along waterways at a distance from each other, in a few families in hamlets, but dispersed. And there was no way that the British, there was no effective way for controlling the problem until people were brought together in large villages rather than being dispersed throughout the countryside. And the Azande were absolutely adamant that they wouldn't do it. They absolutely refused. And this was a mystery to the British. Who doesn't want to be rich or richer? And this. And Evans Pritchard was often the opportunity to go down to spend a year or two living amongst the Azande, learning the language, and coming to a solution, maybe, of how to get the Azande to agree to live together in large villages. So he went down to Zondi land, spent time amongst them, and very early on he came to the conclusion that, so far as the Zondi were concerned, that number one, they were highly rational individuals. So the idea, which is a little bit popular in anthropology at the time, of mystical participation and primitive mentalities, and no, not the, might be for some people, I don't think so, but for the Zondi not. Highly rational people, number one. And number two, they're also very progressive people. So they've already adopted a number of innovations from the British, from the colonial administrators and Egyptians to change. So they're rational and they're progressive. But at the same time, they believe in witches. And they believe that witches are Zondi witches. They're all Zondi, the witches. And witches kill people. They make them sick, they make their children sick, they make their animals sick. But that witchcraft operates in the same way that a gun operates. That someone may have a rifle and you have to worry that he's going to kill you, but if you're far enough away from him, he can't kill you, can't see you, and even if he shoots the rifle, the bullet will never reach the target. Zondi witches work in the same way. If you live far enough away from them, then that you don't have to worry about that. And that's what we do, because we know that witchcraft is a power, an organ within the body that's inherited through the male line. So, and we know that we live together with male members of our patrilineage. Other patrilineages live over there, and they are all potential witches. So if we live far enough from them, then, well, you see, then we should be relatively safe. So Evans Pritchard says, well, this is their explanation for witchcraft. And of course, if you take that as a presumption, there's nothing irrational about the presumptions, but how could this be part of everyday life? How could it be integrated if, in fact, now I'm putting words in his mouth, if, in fact, witchcraft could be part of a Denkstil, what kind of collective could support such a Denkstil, such a belief as to make it reasonable? And Evans Pritchard discovered that the answer to the question is not simply ideas, but apparatuses and practices. To understand Zondi witchcraft, one must understand Zondi technology. And Zondi technology in this case is Zondi Diagnostic Technology. So you see what the claim he's making. Now he says, I want to talk about their diagnostic technology. And in order to talk about it, I want you to understand that diagnostic systems also constitute cultures of a kind, or part cultures. And there are different kinds of diagnostic cultures. And we can talk about them. Now I am putting words in his mouth, my own words, and I've written about this in his mouth, that there are two extreme kinds of diagnostic cultures. You will appreciate this because we recognize immediately what he's talking about. On the one hand, there are internalizing cultures. And an internalizing diagnostic culture is one that proceeds from the surface of the body into the body. It looks at symptoms, it looks at physical signs, and those symptoms and physical signs lead people to certain conclusions about what is taking place inside the body in terms of organs and organ systems and pathophysiology. Even if it's not our pathophysiology, but pathophysiology of that kind. Now, Western medicine is overwhelmingly an internalizing system. Not 100%, but mainly an internalizing system. There are other internalizing systems, not a lot of them. Ayurvedic medicine from South Asia is an internalizing system. Classical Chinese medicine is an internalizing system, but there aren't many like that. At the opposite extreme are externalizing systems. And externalizing systems are no less rational, and cultures are no less rational than the internalizing ones, but they operate on a different perspective. And their perspective is one that does not emphasize pathophysiology, which we take for granted, but rather etiology. Sounds a lot, in this case, like psychoanalysis in that regard, but it focuses on etiology. That is to say, the cause, external cause of the onset of the disorder. Externalizing cultures are characteristically unconcerned with symptoms. Symptoms are not very important to them. The body's not very important to them. In fact, very often they know very little about what's inside the body. Well, they know, I mean, the Zondi know everything about what's inside the body because occasionally they eviscerate each other when they fight. But they don't know how all these things are connected to one another within a system that would constitute a physiological system. Rather, their focus of the culture is a focus on etiology, on causes. And the modality is not one of diagnosing symptoms, but one of narratives. That is, constructing a plausible narrative that would explain the onset of the disorder. Internalizing systems attempt to produce a cure inside the body with regards to the pathophysiology of restoring it to a normal physiology, to a homeostasis. Externalizing systems work by attempting to eliminate the external cause of the disease. So you see, they're operating, it's not that one is more logical than the other. They're equally, in the abstract, they're equally logical, but they're two completely different cultures, two completely different ways of reasoning, two completely different Denkstils. He said, if you understand that Zondi witchcraft is not irrational, it's not crazy, it's not childlike, it is a different culture, a different Denkstil, then the next thing that you've got to do, and that I've done in my work and in this book, is to concentrate on their diagnostic technologies. And their diagnostic technologies, to our minds, are very, very strange because they don't involve the body. In fact, the sick person doesn't have to be present. In fact, rarely is the sick person present when the diagnosis goes on. And they have various ways of doing it, and he describes them as oracles and forms of divination. I won't go through them. They're very elaborate, and they go through a whole series of tests, diagnostic tests, using different oracles, going from the free ones up to the most expensive ones, because they can't, because it is expensive. And the most expensive one's a chicken oracle, in which they bring out chickens and they ask the chicken questions, and they put a special kind of paste down the chicken's throat, made out of peppers in a very special way, and they have to go and they have to get it, and it's very dangerous. And if the chicken dies, the answer is yes. If the chicken doesn't die, the answer is no. And then they get, and all the questions are binary questions, and they go through a series of binary questions until they finally get down to the name of the witch, the person who is causing the problem. So again, there's nothing strange or mystical about it, particularly this kind of binary reasoning and using, okay, we don't believe chickens tell anything, but if you accept that premise, there's nothing irrational about it. And then they go to the person, in the most typical case, the prototypical case, they go to the house of the accused witch, And often it's someone who has previously been accused of being a witch, because they're the usual suspects, and that's what they ask the oracle first, because you can find that out. You don't have to kill a lot of chickens. It's not so expensive. In any event, they go to the house and they threaten the person. And they present him with the wing of the chicken that identified him by name. And what he has to do is to break the spell, and by breaking it, well, he does this just by taking some water and blowing the water over the wing of the chicken that named him. But of course, it is also a confession of culpability, of guilt. And that's very dangerous to do, because next time someone gets sick, your name's going to be number one when they start going through the oracle, and if the person dies before they reach you, then they're not going to ask any questions. They're just going to come around and try to kill you, or kill another kinsman in the same male line. Okay, so you see it's a very interesting system, the way that it is concerned. Okay, and Evans Pritchard says completely rational, works in a completely rational way, and blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now, what I want to do is I want to say, with this very sketchy account of Zondi Witchcraft, is to take it and put it in the context of Denkstil and Denkkollektiv and styles of reasoning and Ian Hacking and Karl Popper and everything that we've said, and see how they illuminate what's going on. And I think that once you see how they explain what the Zondi are doing, and that it is analogous to what psychiatric science does, it will be very interesting, to be very illuminating, again, vindicating the idea of what we can call epistemic cultures and culture of psychiatry. And if you turn to page 2 on your the handout, and you'll see that I passed through everything that's on the page up to this point. I've discussed. So you have notes, you can check on it and come back tomorrow and tell me about all the contradictions you found. But in any event, but move down to the number 4. And number 4 speaks about the context of Zondi Witchcraft and as a style of reasoning. And as a rational style of reasoning, characterizing not an individual, but a collectivity of individuals. And these are being performed by male kinsmen and so on, and so forth. And Evans Pritchard's conclusion, I'm putting words in his mouth, and now I'm putting Ian Hacking's words in his mouth, that the fact that the Zondi can be rational, can be progressive, and can believe nonsense, that is to say that there are witches, can all be reconciled. Their rationality, the fact that they're progressive, and the fact that they believe in what looks to us like nonsense, can be explained in terms of the way that this system of reasoning, style of reasoning, operates, because it has 3 qualities. And the 3 qualities are, it is self-confirming, it is self-vindicating, and is self-validating. Now, I wanted to say something about each of those terms. And you say, oh, how boring is the end of the afternoon. So tired, this for sure will put me to sleep. Not that interested in Zondi Witchcraft. I know that. But you are interested in psychiatric science. And Hacking's argument comes not out of his discussion of Zondi Witchcraft. He doesn't do that anywhere. It is I who have brought the 2 of them together this afternoon. Hacking is talking about laboratory science in a very celebrated article that he wrote about this laboratory science as a style of reasoning. So his prototype, what makes it so interesting, is that he is talking about bench science and how bench science works. And what I am arguing, and Hacking agrees, is that the same operation characterizes Zondi Witchcraft. Okay, what's happening? What does self-confirming mean? It means it's empirical. Now, we say the word empirical. First people say, oh my God, how could this be empirical? This is mystical, magical, primitive thinking. How could it be empirical? It is empirical. Maybe you don't know what empirical means. I know you do. What about other people who make this complaint? What does empirical mean? It means predicated on experience. That is to say, what we can actually see and hear and feel and observe. And it's empirical in that way. It's not theoretical, but it's empirical. And it is self-confirming in that most of the predictions that it makes indeed do come true. That is the Zondi system, just as our own system, tend to be weighted, the culture is weighted to making predictions about things, events that are going to happen anyway. Number two, it is self-vindicating. Self-vindicating means it can take the inevitable anomalies, that is what doesn't make sense, and explain them by means of these auxiliary hypotheses. And for a long time it was believed that so-called primitive people could not recognize anomalies, that they couldn't do falsificationism because they wouldn't even recognize what an anomaly is in the first place, because their thinking is mystical. Evans Pritchard said, please, this is malarkey. The Zondi are very aware of anomalies all the time. They're aware in the terms of the procedure with regards to the poison article that very often contradictions occur, that the article does not proceed in the way that it's supposed to proceed. And they recognize that these are anomalies, that there's something wrong here. But how do they explain them? The same way that we do, in terms of the auxiliary hypotheses and in terms of the tweaking with the technology in this regard. So with regards to the poison article, there are many, many examples he gives, but with regards to the poison article, he said, well, the one problem is when anomalies turn out, you see what they're really very interesting people. Sorry I have to go into all the details. But when they, for example, when the chicken names who the person is who is the witch and lays down its life to make that, what the Zondi then do is they don't stand up and grab their spears and start dancing in circles the way they do in the movies. What they do is they take another chicken. And they take the chicken and they ask that chicken in an opposite way to see if the oracle is going to lie. And so they invert the question in a way to see if it will lie. Now, what it should be is that the second chicken should survive. That is to say that the hypothesis is refuted, that is, the rival hypothesis is refuted, and therefore they know that the dead chicken, that part of the article, was true. However, sometimes both chickens die. And it's the case of what do we call the law of the excluded middle. Something cannot be both A and not A at the same time. And both chickens dying is exactly that. Both A and not A are true. And the Zondi scratch their heads that this is not true. It's an anomaly. It's an anomaly that's got to be explained. And they have interesting explanations for it. And one explanation has to do with the nature of the poison that they put down, where it was gathered. But the point is that they recognize the anomaly, and they do the same thing with the anomaly that we do. Here I put down the example of the test-retest. All you epidemiologists know that. Doing this all the time, test-retest. Okay, and number three, they're self-validating. And self-validating means there is no appeal to a higher authority. That there's no one to go. There's no one to say, let's take this to the Zondi Supreme Court of Epistemology. There is no Supreme Court. This is the highest level of authority. And if you think that shows somebody, I feel that the disorder that I study, PTSD, I have sometimes fantasies that there should be a Supreme Court of psychiatric knowledge to which I could take 90% of this research and send it up to them for them to send it back and say this should never have been published. But there is no Supreme Court. It is self-validating, and it's self-validating within the Dent Collective, and the Dent Collective, in this case, of traumatologists and people who study it. And so I know I shouldn't talk that way as an anthropologist, but sometimes cannot suppress it. Okay, let me just conclude by giving you this example. And here you see, and pretend now that you're in a Zondi, or at least you're Evans Pritchard. And we start with Hamlet A. And in Hamlet A, Mr. X dies. The oracles are performed, and they indicate that it's a case of witchcraft. So he's already dead. There's no way they can stop it. However, they want to nail the witch. They want to kill the witch who's done this. But they haven't identified who the witch is. And that's very expensive to do in terms of numbers of chickens. And it's also very risky. I mean, you do identify him, and then you're going to go out and try to kill him. There are all kinds of, but there's another way. And the other way is that amongst the Zondi, there are people that Evans Pritchard describes as sorcerers. And sorcerers are medical specialists. And the same, we've got to understand it as part of this medical culture and medical system. They consult a sorcerer, they pay him, and he releases a substance into the air called Benge. And the Benge then seeks out the witch that's responsible for it. Okay, now we said it's nonsense. How could Benge do that? Okay, for the Zondi, it's a black box. They don't know how he does it. But we, in psychiatry, should never talk about black boxes, and we don't know how it's actually working. And go back to the part of my lecture that I spoke about the specificity of new pharma in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and in the 2012s. So the fact that they don't know how it operates doesn't disqualify them. But what they do now is that they now monitor, listen to what people are saying about the local area, about all the other hamlets in their region. And remember, witchcraft has to be relatively close. It can't be that they are identified, that they're being killed by a witch in Japan. It's not possible. It has to be in Zondi land, has to be in their part of Zondi land. So their capacity, again, you think about this in terms of a Dent collective. It has to be within the pool of knowledge and observation that they can see that's going on. And what they observe is that a Mr. Y has died. Maybe he dies a week later, 2 weeks later, in Hamlet B. Therefore, the oracle confirms for them that Y is a witch. And they will then perform an oracle to see if he really was the witch, and usually it confirms it, and blah, blah, blah. So you see the way in which it would work. But that's only part of it. Let's quickly travel to Hamlet Y, Hamlet B rather, where Mr. Y has just died. And what's going on there? What's going on there is that his male relatives are consulting an oracle. Oracle tells them it's witchcraft. They consult a sorcerer, pay him, sorcerer releases Benge. They now monitor the local mortality to see if someone has died, and they observe that Mr. Z in Hamlet C dies 2 weeks later. And they come to the conclusion, he must be the witch. They consult an oracle, oracle confirms it, they're happy. Okay, story almost over. Then go to Hamlet C. Well, I don't have to, the story's really over, right? Hamlet C is the same thing. There's this cycle that's sort of sweeping through a wave that's sweeping through Zondi land, and a wave sweeping back in terms of in terms of deaths, in terms of diagnoses, in terms of identifying witches, and that is self-replicating. It just doesn't end. So in a sense, that's the story. And in that sense, talk about contradictions. I have two number 4s here. Second number 4, number 5. The puzzle is solved. And the solution to the puzzle, you must understand, is that Zondi witches are real things. They really do exist. They don't exist in the sense that either Y or Z or anyone else is someone who's a self-conscious witch. They're not. Witches exist as a reality that is constituted within the Denk collective. But it is real. It is real in the sense of it's being evidenced in sickness, death, in terms of the technologies that are involved, and so on. So Zondi witches are real, and witches are just come down to the very end, are the cultures, the diagnostic cultures, epistemic thing. They are the object around which all of these practices are organized and that are being materialized within those practices. And the argument that I would make, the comparison that I would make with regards to psychiatry, may sound outlandish to some of you, but I think it's a very conservative argument, that in many ways, disorders that we are speaking about within psychiatry, many cases, maybe the majority of diagnosed cases of PTSD, for example, I feel more comfortable of saying this, are the analogs to Zondi witches. They are real, there's real suffering, there's real misery, all of that is true, not to deny that. Likewise, amongst the that there is a reality to those diagnoses and to those cases, but that reality is not to be explained in terms of a reality that precedes history or precedes culture, but rather is a product of culture. And as human beings, that's the best we can do. And in terms of developments within medicine, like infectious medicine, we've done pretty well with regards to comparing biomedicine, scientific medicine, to other medical traditions. Okay, that's my vindication of talking about culture of psychiatry. We meet tomorrow, be something very different, and that's about emotion.